Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Carter. I'm the editorial director at iGaming Business, and I'll be moderating today's session. We're delighted to be hosting a webinar with Onfido today, looking at key learnings from Fintech and how to make compliance your competitive advantage. In this webinar today, James Hiller, who is Business Development Lead at Onfido, will be discussing how gaming can learn from other regulated industries and turn compliance into a competitive advantage. There'll be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please do submit questions as we go along. We'll try to address as many of them as possible in the allocated time. With that, I'm going to pass over to James to introduce himself. Over to you, James.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending. As Steve said, this is going to be a learning from Fintech webinar, and basically how to make compliance your competitive advantage. My name is James, and I represent Onfido, who are a global identity verification technology provider. So what are we going to discuss today? Really, I think we're going to be focusing on three things. Number one, why the problems facing iGaming today are nothing new. Number two, the sort of secret sauce that we're going to call it for today that iGaming can learn from Fintech. And number three, how we can start thinking about the above in your business and how to really make that as powerful as possible for you. So just a quick snapshot to kind of start us off. Gaming in 2020, what are the challenges? Well, to be quite honest, it probably is a bit more wide-reaching than just these three things. But the three things that we're going to focus on today, and the three things I suppose that we can really help with, are fraud prevention, regulatory compliance, and customer experience. And I think from a fraud sort of prevention perspective, really what we're seeing is that there is more and more sophisticated types of frauds, account takeover, friendly fraud, etc., things like chargebacks. From a regulatory compliance perspective, it's quite a fragmented regulatory environment across the EU. Having worked closely with lots of different operators over the past year or two, it also seems as though there's not much clarity around how to actually be compliant, which is a problem. And number three, the customer experience and how actually players nowadays are very unloyal, and as if the experience of actually being able to use the account isn't what they would deem appropriate, they'll very happily change and move to somebody different. And actually, just to keep sort of topical, I suppose, I've just seen that today Mr. Green was hit with a £3 million fine for failing to have effective procedures in place, basically preventing harm and money laundering. So I suppose this is even more relevant now than it ever has been. So we've actually seen this all, I suppose, before. The interesting about the problems you're seeing is they've actually occurred before in a different industry, in the sort of the financial services industry, and that's something that Onfido has kind of seen firsthand with some of our clients. So I'm going to try and take you down sort of a trip down memory lane now, outlining how financial services disruptors, or fintechs as perhaps they're more commonly known, have sort of come about, and the journey that they have been on. So going back to financial services in 2012, London hosted the Olympics. I seem to remember. I'm a football fan. Spain won the Euros, and as a consumer, I think the bulk of my sort of financial world revolved around my relationship with my bank, which happens to have been NatWest. So these banks were more often than not branch-based. I might access them through their web portal or whichever jargon they might have been using back then, but the bulk of the important stuff was done one-to-one at a physical store. So the important stuff really looked like this. It was current accounts, go to my bank, get a credit card, went to my bank, sending money abroad, go to my bank, mortgages, any kind of personal lending, no matter what service it was, I went to NatWest and they did all of those things for me. If we fast forward to 2020, what we've seen is an explosion of these fintech operators. People like Revolut, Monzo, obviously very well known within the UK, people like Curve, Moniz, LendInvest, Remitly, WorldRemit, TransferWise, have all come about over the last kind of sort of 3 or 4, 5 years, and have focused on one of particular of these different services. So now you can open up a current account. If you're an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, go to Monzo, go to Moniz, go to Starling, all on my mobile, super easy. You want to get a credit card, go to Tandem, go to Revolut on your mobile. If you want to send money abroad, you can go to TransferWise or WorldRemit, all from the mobile. And what we've seen is that actually by getting that approach right on mobile and making it more attractive to the kind of people who are signing up for these accounts around the world, they've actually won, and they've gained huge market share. And I suppose really the possibilities are endless. So I can just pull out my phone, type in banking, mortgage, insurance, see what comes to the top. And in every single one of those cases, there will be a mobile first or app driven experience that makes it super easy for me to sign up for one of those accounts. No more applying for stuff online, then being asked to send something in via email, or even worse, having to physically actually go into a branch and do it. All from the mobile, all immediate, and all just simply using a document and being able to access my mobile phone. So financial services in 2012, what did that look like? Well, the challenges really at the time were fraud prevention. At the time, they were experiencing a 60% increase in fraud attacks year on year. Absolutely incredible numbers, translating to over 20 billion in losses in 2012. From a regulatory compliance perspective, to be fair, the UK pretty much leads the way in terms of financial regulation with the steer of the FCA, but actually the rest of the EU, super fragmented, not too dissimilar to the different license operators within the EU for gaming. And then from a customer experience perspective, lots of 30% of customers not signing up due to a lack of trust or understanding of how the procedures worked. It just wasn't clear enough, which actually put a lot of people off. So imagine you're a professional fraudster in 2012 and you're hearing about banks doing it all online from the ground up. You're rubbing your hands and thinking, this is easy. And really, for a lot of the fintechs, that's something that they had to really try hard to navigate. So over the period from 2012 to about 2017, 2018, we saw highs of 60% increases in fraud year on year. And that's enough to kill pretty much any business. And it wasn't just sort of bad guys take IDs and open account fraud. It was impersonation fraud. It was mule accounts, instances of account taker through activities like social engineering, and due to the prevalence of information that we all hold on one another now online. So does that sound familiar? It should do. What we've got now is really sort of a very fragmented regulatory landscape, getting between you and winning in every single different market. So that might be fraud attacks from mule accounts, chargebacks, people trying to cheat new online systems, all the kind of stories that we hear all the time from compliance and operational staff at operators all over the world. You have the customer experience at the end of it all. How do I get the customer through the door and retained as quickly as possible without breaking the rules? It should all sound pretty familiar, and that's where gaming is at today. And it's a few years behind finance, we believe, when it comes to nailing down the road to adoption and how to really gain that market share, ultimately turning fraud customer experience into a competitive advantage. So financial services in 2020, we think is a real success story. Here are sort of 3 success stories from our own customer base, of course, to just try and talk you through sort of how they've been able to navigate that landscape. So CoinFloor are an online trading platform. They've managed to reduce their fraud on their platform by 72% by making the most out of a technology-led approach. bunq, a mobile-only current account provider, enabled themselves to onboard more users in a compliant way, actually being able to onboard 5 times the number of users versus the old way of doing things without needing to hire any more staff whatsoever. And Money Match, for those of you who don't know, are an online remittance service. They kind of leverage technology to navigate the demands local regulations put on their customer experience. Essentially, what we've managed to do is to turn a 15-minute call, going through quite a laborious process, into a not to registered verification process that takes less than 3 minutes. So they actually come from a very sort of effective process where actually they were already only doing it in 15 minutes, and we've managed to enhance that again by being able to save them $8 per user in terms of their sign-up journey and reduce that to just 3 minutes. And these are just a few examples of how fintechs have made compliance their competitive advantage, in this landscape. So, Onfido, as we know, we work with a lot of them. So we say, look, the success of these fintechs, Monzo, Revolut, 2 of our major clients, who went from 0 market share in 2014 to dominating new account openings in the UK and Europe in 2019. They've put fear into the hearts of some of these big banks that have been operating for 150, 200 years, and showed that if you take the right approach, you can get the balance right of fraud reduction, compliance, and that customer experience, getting those 3 things working in harmony with one another. And really what they've done is to make sure that then sets them apart in what is, essentially a very crowded financial services space. So, as an education piece, here are a couple of the specifics that financial services did to turn their problems in fraud, compliance, and that customer experience into solutions. And if you're reading these problems and thinking that's me, then you really aren't alone there. What we're going to do now is take a look at what the transformation within finance looks like, and then turn it to how that would work for you. So let's start with fraud. On the left is where financial service providers and fintech started out in 2012 and the problems that essentially caused them. And on the right is how providers solve these problems in a market-leading way. I'll run through a couple of these sort of in turn. So an over-reliance on databases. In gaming especially, and I'm an avid sports gambler or gamer, we live and die by databases. They're the cheapest and easiest way to tick a compliance box and get a customer through the door. I know that, you know that. But as I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, they're exclusive and they're quite easy to exploit. Within reason, I could quite easily impersonate the vast majority of my friends and family and open up accounts in their names. And I'm sure most people on this call could do the exact same thing. Also exclusive in that customers with thin credit files can't get through the door. That's some students, migrants, and a whole younger crop of players. The world's getting smaller. The UK in particular is probably one of the most diverse countries on the planet, and there's people from all over the world living and working here. Exploitable also in that they're prone to breaches. In fact, actually, the other day, reading the US government advised against databases as an authentication method because they've seen sort of so much fraud in relation to social security numbers that are too easy to basically get hold of and use in the wrong way. So nowadays, and I'm sure you've all been through the sign-up flows for Monzo and Revolut, etc., they verify real-world identities such as an ID document and a biometric, essentially a picture of your face, instantly. No more best guessing, just best practices the whole way through. Online methods for online products, and I suppose really what we're talking about here is just the difficulty in how you can't actually physically hold the identity document in your hand. And so what we're trying to do here is, by deferring to those technologies, we're actually able to ask people to verify real life documents, capture and verifying information live, as opposed to people being able to send things in later on, have the ability to kind of doctor or change documents to suit them, and actually then be able to get around some of these processes. And then in terms of attacks from different angles, and this is becoming more and more prevalent, of course, things like money mules, chargebacks, account takeover, sign-up bonus abusers, the list goes on. Day in, day out, fintechs will be struggling against this, having manual teams to review, or worse, actually just not being able to deal with it, and so doing no checks at all. And I know that there are some compliance teams in the gaming world who also are overrun with these issues and who just can't handle the amount of work that they are required to do, especially on the budget that they're given. So poorly trained fraud reviewers have been shown in studies to have actually up to about a 50% error rate on detecting ID fraud alone. The mind gets tired, you start making easier decisions, and you stop thinking about what you're doing. And basically, in the end, this costs businesses with small margins big money. There's not huge margins in gaming, as we all know, so actually these problems can cause big problems for the operators, and ultimately can kill businesses, which is something that you obviously do not want to happen, particularly in the early stages. So nowadays, these providers use risk engines, not just risk people. And that's the clear thing we're talking about here. It's risk engines, not just more people. Processing thousands upon thousands of documents every day by combining a database check with transaction monitoring, with device analytics, and with a verified user identity. Basically taking the risk out and empowering the business to fend off bad actors right from the very start. So, and the same goes for user experience. And I suppose this bit from the experience perspective is key. An analog experience for digital users. To capture a new generation of users and to win market share, fintechs had to move away from thinking about doing what we did in store. It just doesn't work. But put it on a web browser. No, it needs to be different. Customers expect much more than that now, and they've cottoned on much quicker. And nowadays, I'm going to point to a business like, I don't know, Revolut here. They're innovating what a banking experience looks like. It's intuitive, it's built from the ground up for a mobile experience, and a lesson that gaming can take away for sure is departing the mindset of in-store but on web and thinking about that mobile-first, younger generation approach. Putting profit before protections, something of a contentious point perhaps, but financial technology also recognised that a good experience isn't actually always the fastest experience. In an old world, all friction was seen as bad. and minimal checks, blockers, etc. were put in place. This meant that money mules and other vulnerable people could get through and into the product. Not good. Nowadays, profit and protection are closer to kind of being equal, I would call, if not on par. Companies see that protecting the user enables them to build a defensible brand and actually stand out. That's why you see industry-wide regulations such as strong customer authentication pop up, or company-specific things like Monzo's merchant self-exclusion, which I know that they use actually for gaming, pop up. And user experience isn't just a get me from A to B fast. It's also about helping the customer on that journey and putting them first. Make them feel loved, make them feel like it's a really enjoyable experience for them. And finally, regulation and compliance. So I suppose really what we think before, it was very much a local mindset with a global approach. And what I mean by that is in attempting to conquer all markets at once, but not sufficiently building for local or niche regulations and policymakers, from the FCA to BaFin in Germany, borders became burdens for financial institutions, not really an opportunity. Companies would try and expand, then basically withdraw services all of a sudden, picking up fines along the way because they tried and they couldn't do it. And we see a lot of similar things happening in gaming, of course, as well. Nowadays, fintechs are a bit smarter with what they're doing. They generally take a very much a global mindset with a localized approach, basically actively working with local regulators to plan and build for a future of financial regulation rather than waiting to see what happened next. Not enough data, not enough quality. We've seen this in fintechs, largely driving by compliance functions, moving from traction and willful ignorance to nowadays building with accountability in mind, opting for transparent tooling, full reporting, auditing, and everything that's associated. So the secret sauce, it starts with identity. So I think really identity is the core solution to the three forces we've spoken about previously. Identity lets you know who's coming through the door so you can catch bad actors. Identity is how you stay ahead of the complex regulatory landscape, of course. And identity is also how you effectively get the good people through the door and give them a good experience through the player journey. Traditional ways of doing identity, like databases, we don't believe are any longer meeting these sort of challenges, meeting these requirements. I suppose really the increasing dramatic breaches mean that they don't stop impersonation fraud or friendly fraud, and they also mean you can't onboard with thin credit file individuals. They're also starting to become more outdated from a regulatory perspective, as different geographies are starting to implement stronger rules, as you all know. And they also mean that because you've never anchored to an account to a real identity, I suppose, you can't truly trust that user down the line. So actually they have a worse player experience, and ultimately that's what we're trying to change. So the secret sauce with Onfido, we really think looks a bit like this. New generation identity services will catch impersonation and friendly fraud because you're anchoring users to a government issued ID, and if needed, also a biometric of the applicant's or the customer's face. And this means that if someone does act fraudulently, your fraud team have very definitive information to work from. That's the important thing. It's more robust from a regulatory perspective, and this means you have a full audit trail. You can present to your regulators exactly what you've done, fully tracked, to ensure that you are compliant and they're happy with the processes that you've implemented to ensure you're following the right regulation and you're protecting the player. And it can mitigate friction at sign up, and this bit I really want to focus on, by using autofill technology to reduce keystrokes or tap-ins to sign up. Plus, because the account is anchored to a real-life document, you can use biometrics to recheck if it is them at high-risk moments. For example, I've heard stories from different compliance chaps at different operators, who I won't mention right now, of trying to check whether a 60-year-old woman who'd only ever bet on bingo was really suddenly betting £1,000 a game on a Singapore under-18s game on a Monday morning at 7 AM. And trying to work out if it was really them, and spending huge amounts of time and effort trying to contact them to try and verify if that account had been taken over. And I really use that as obviously an exaggerated example, but I think everyone on the call will probably appreciate that there are times where you think, actually this is strange activity. We need to investigate this. And I think we all know that actually your resources are limited. by using a government issue ID at its inception, and also then being able to have a biometric to compare against that at any stage in the customer lifecycle, means that actually you can do those checks automatically, efficiently, and very, very effectively with almost no difficulty at all. So what does it look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this. And for those of you who've signed up for people like Revolut and Monzo and Monese, etc., you'll have probably seen this before. But the user experience typically involves kind of 3 screens. So the first screen is where we ask for the customer to provide their document. Pretty simple. They take a photograph of their driver's license, their ID card, their passport, whatever government issue document they've got. It doesn't matter which document they've got, we can then verify its authenticity. Secondly, we can then pre-populate those forms. So appreciating that people want to get betting as fast as possible, often actually having to go through a difficult form can put people off, and it can actually disrupt that player sign-up journey. So actually, let's populate it for them automatically. Just extract the data from the document and inject it into that flow. And then thirdly, if required, and only if, we can also ask for a biometric at sign-up. You don't have to, but what that will do, it will anchor that person to that document, ensuring that I haven't borrowed my brother's document or my friend's document to open an account, of course, and that it truly is me who's signing up for that account at that point of inception. So create different flows based on different signals. And I suppose what we really mean here is actually you can customize this. You haven't got to adopt a single approach for every different market, for every single customer. You can customize it based on the risk profile that's associated to the individual, based on the country, based on anything that you particularly want to judge it by. And if they're deemed low risk, you might just choose a document first, and then do a database check for your PEPs and sanctions, for example, just to ensure that, of course, they're not on any of those lists. And if they're high risk, you might then say, well, actually, we'll do a biometric check as well to link them to the document, so you know they're not presenting a stolen ID. And there might be different geographies where that's more important than others. So they're just showing you a very simple flow as to how that would look. And because I suppose you're anchoring it to a document, or in either way, what you're really doing is your risk signals can tell you if an account might have been compromised. And this is the big thing here. Say a player wants to recover their account, which would typically mean a help desk call or something similar, you know, an email or a series of events. You could just trigger a selfie to that individual and say, hi, James, we just want to make sure it's still you. Ask the person to conduct a selfie, which can be either a photo or a short video on their phone, to ensure that that person is still in control of that same account. Because you've got that government issued document to anchor it against, you can quickly see, yes, it's the same person, that person's verified, and then they get access to their account immediately, saving all that time and effort and cost in order to regain access. So that kind of summarizes, I suppose, what we want to try and to cover today.
Thanks, James. I think we're just drawing to the end of our slot now. I think sort of what we have time for today. So thank you very much again to James and Onfido for joining us and sharing your insight. Today's webinar has been recorded and we're available to listen on demand shortly for you to sort of rewatch and share with your colleagues. Otherwise, we'll see you soon. Also got an extra little bit of news as well. I've been informed here that Onfido will also be appearing at ICE North America in New Orleans, May 13th to 14th. So for more information on the event, visit icenorthamerica.com, and feel free to get in touch with Onfido to book some time on site. Thank you very much, James, and hope to see you, as many of you back here as possible, future webinars. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.